Well, hello, everyone. We are at the top of the hour. We're going to get started with our event today. We have registrants from across the United States, as well as some other countries. We're very excited about that. As you come into the event, if you would put in the chat where you're joining us from, we would love to know where you're from, and we can highlight that. Thank you so much. Well, welcome to this educational discussion. And what we're going to cover is what you need to know to move forward with the FDA's Food Safety Modernization Act, FSMA, Rule 204D, and also consider its implications for you in the food industry. I'd like to thank our meeting host, Farm to Plate, for this session. They are a software company specifically created to meet the needs of the food industry supply chain. And I see we have people from Louisiana, Connecticut, California, Georgia, Ontario, Canada. Thanks for joining us. Memphis, Tennessee. Thanks for joining us. We're so excited to have such a group of people from across all parts. Thank you so much. In order to provide us with information so that we can be most useful to you today, because our goal is to impart the information that you're seeking right now where you are in your journey. We do have an anonymous poll I would ask you to take a look at and just check one of the options in that poll to gauge where you are in the process of complying with Rule 204. And your individual answer will not be made public. It will just be your the group's some of the group's answers are going to be made public to everyone. So don't worry that we're going to call you out in any way. This is just to inform us. While you answer the poll, for those of you who may not be as familiar with Zoom, I know we have a lot of different platforms that we operate on in the business world. You have control over a few things. First, you'll notice in the bottom of your screen that we have a chat option. And if you have a question or you'd like to chat with any of the other attendees, or if you have a technical issue, please enter that in the chat. Our producers are monitoring that. I'll be monitoring that as well. And we'll be sure to answer you, or the Q&A particularly. We want to be sure to answer your questions while you're here today. The other thing is, you'll notice I'm spotlighted, and depending on what view you've chosen, you're going to see that a little differently. In the upper right-hand corner of your screen, there is a view option. If you click on that, you have speaker and gallery. One of them will be checked, and you can toggle between those two to see which view you would prefer. Either way, you will receive a recording of the event after today. We will send you a recording for being a registered attendee. So thank you. We have somebody from Delhi who joined us from India. Welcome. It is late at night in India, so we're glad you're here. Well, let me get started. My name is Pam Linemiller, and I'm going to help navigate us through today's event. So we have 3 informative sessions planned in the next hour, beginning with sharing some of the highlights of Rule 204. Then we're going to have an expert from the FDA give us perspective on the industry expectations and requirements. Then our last discussion will revolve around probably why a lot of you are here, how you can move forward toward compliance with the rule. And then we are going to finish out our hour with an interactive Q&A with all of our panelists coming back up. If you have questions, you can put them in the chat or save them for our Q&A. And if you're comfortable coming on camera and asking your question, we would love to have you do that. Could our producers please close the poll at this point and share it with all of us so we can get an idea of who is on the event with us today? I'd appreciate that. And thank you for entering where you're from. It's really fun to have people from all across the United States and Canada and India and the different countries, because the rule really does apply to all of us. Let's see. Let's get started with our first discussion. If you're able to share that poll with the group, please do so, even though I'm introducing our panelists. Oh, there we go. Let's just take a look at that real quick. I have it on another screen up here. So a good percentage of you don't really know about the rule, a full fifth of you. So that's great, 20%. Some of you have heard of the rule. a lot of you are aware, but you need to figure out what to do. And this is the perfect event for you. We're so glad you're here. And then there's also another fifth or a little more that you already have started steps to comply. Congratulations. We're excited to have you with us, and that really will help us as we go forward in our discussions. Let's get started with our first one. First, joining me, I have Bill Ritzy. He's a third generation 40-year veteran of food manufacturing and distribution. Bill has held positions at the distributor and distributor buying group level, as well as various manufacturers. As a VP and general manager of the Independent Procurement Alliance Program, IPAP, Bill built a dairy redistribution company that reached $100 million in annual sales within a 10-year period. He then held various marketing, sales, and supply chain positions with Treehouse Foods, helping that company increase from $700 million to $6 billion in annual sales in his 16 years with that organization. In 2018, he began his journey to bring technology into the transactional activity up and down the food supply chain. Welcome, Bill. And he is joined by Audra Jansen. She's a seasoned professional with well over 30 years of global experience in technology solutions for industries such as retail, manufacturing, healthcare, and pharmaceuticals. She's held key roles at leading companies like Citrix Systems, say that 3 times fast, Oracle, Bitdefender, and SGS, guiding organizations in North America, Europe, and Asia Pacific. Otter's expertise in information technology, software, and services makes her a valuable asset in the food industry sector. Welcome, Bill and Audra.
Thank you, Pam.
Thank you, Pam.
Well, listen, based on this poll, we can see that a lot of our participants are seeking information about Rule 204 and how they can move forward, which is exactly what this event is about.
Yeah, thanks, Pam. We are so delighted to have all of you here this morning. I understand we have folks from all over North America as well as globally, and in all different positions of the supply chain. So that makes it really exciting because it will impact everybody. So one thing I want to stress is that you are not alone in this journey. It is affecting the food industry, and we are here to guide you and help you along the way in reaching compliance by the deadline.
Yeah, well, are there some resources available to help that we're going to cover?
Absolutely. So there are so many resources available. And if anyone's Googled it, you will find it's a lot. There's tens of pages in the rule itself. There's a lot of resources. So determining which are the ones you really should be focused on is something we can help you maneuver through. And also, since this was finalized in December of 2022, food supply chain contributors have been struggling to find the right solution for their unique needs. And there is not one way to do it. So we can help you, figure out what's the best thing for your organization with your size and your position in the food supply chain.
Yeah, that's exciting. Well, Audra, you are having conversations every day about this rule, like all the time. What are some of the questions that you're being asked?
Yeah. So I speak with leaders regularly within all types of job roles, and they all have different concerns, as you might imagine. So I'm talking with suppliers and manufacturers, distributors, brokers, redistributors. So all of those folks have a different thing that they need to focus on for meeting their compliance requirements. And it is difficult to navigate to some degree, and we're going to help you make sense of that and simplify things hopefully for you.
Yeah, that would be the purpose of today. Well, let's jump in on some of the details of the rule. What do people need to know?
Well, Pam, I think that the reason the rule was established, which was to shift FDA from a responsive company to or organization to a proactive organization and help the industry to identify areas that need assistance in the supply chain where food safety comes along. Rule 204 consists of a food traceability listing, which identifies various food products. And the major categories for what we're talking about in 204 are seafood, produce, soft and semi-soft cheeses, shell eggs, nut butters, and ready-to-eat deli salads. The FDA gave a ranking to all food categories, and those are the categories that have the most risk associated with them. However, I want to emphasize the FDA did rank all food categories. So while these are the ones with the most risk, down the road, I would see that other categories that have the next highest level of risk will be included in this as well. That's my speculation anyway.
So maybe we're starting with the highest levels of risk first, and then you can just see this being implemented across.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And it does affect every level of the supply chain from harvester through to consumer. And I think that the fact that imported product as well as domestic product comes under this gives us this worldview where we have people all over the world joining us today. And the fact that all of this, it's a fair playing field with both import and domestic. They have to comply with this rule. But the date of compliance, Audra mentioned when it was brought into law, the date of compliance is January 20th, 2026. And that's a date that should be ingrained in everyone's mind when it comes to talking about 204. You see on the screen a little calculator that we've put together that says that between now and January 20th, 2026, there's 572 days, calendar days. What we find is most customers are asking their suppliers to have a system in place by October 1st of 2025 so that they can have 2 months to test the data and the data flow. That cuts 111 days off of that total number of days between now and enforcement. So we're talking about 66 weeks roughly, or 330 work days. If a company has 10 suppliers and 125 customers that deal in this food traceability listing categories, that is an expectation that the company will have to map their data with a supplier or customer every 2.44 days.
Sorry.
Which is very difficult and brings us to a point of, while this is about data collecting, it's also about data communication. And that's a big aspect of Rule 204.
Wow. And so those are some of the things that make it different too. Thank you for highlighting that. So is this information that food companies already have, or do they need to create it?
Well, I think that the name of the rule is additional requirements. We talk to some companies that say, well, we're FDA compliant, which is true for right now. But this is additional rules and additional data that has to be captured.
Well, that's the one thing I'm hoping is a big takeaway from today, is that you may be doing these things within your walls, within your entity, but it isn't being necessarily shared up and downstream. And that's the difference. That's the new requirement.
Yeah. Well, can we just opt out? I know if I'm on the call, I'm thinking, can't I just opt out?
Everyone hopes that was the case, but it is not. It is not voluntary. So, it's a mandate coming up.
Okay, that's important for everyone to know. You can't just opt out, that it's requiring you to have information to be shared.
Yeah, we have a lot of companies that say, well, what if my supplier doesn't want to do this? And that's really, I hate to put it this way, but not an option, is that these are requirements. They are enforceable by the FDA. And understand the FDA wants to work with companies. They want to help get them into compliance. So it's a positive thing for the industry that everyone follows these rules and comes in by the enforcement date.
Well, yeah, and how do we get, do all of this communication that's required? I know that a lot of people on the event are probably asking that question.
I can address that. It's all about standardization. So we need to find a way to communicate between varying software legacy systems. Companies have invested a lot in their, ERPs or WMS systems, or maybe they don't have anything in place yet, and that's okay. We can help you standardize it so that it can be shared in up and downstream. And we've been working closely with GS1 to get that, in place so that we can help you do that. And so that's where we focus on. We can guide you through that.
Great. Well, listen, thank you, Audra and Bill, for this first discussion. To give us further insight into what this means for you, I'd like to invite Angela Fields to join me. She is a senior consumer safety officer for the Coordinated Outbreak Response and Evaluation Network. It's referred to as CORE. As a member of CORE Response, she provides epidemiologic and traceback expertise and evaluation of data related to outbreaks in support of FDA's response activities. Additionally, she serves as one of CORE's traceability subject matter experts, participating in agency initiatives and providing internal and external training on traceability and outbreak response. She was one of the policy developers for Food Traceability Rule and is currently working on initiatives surrounding the implementation of the rule, both internally to the agency and externally to industry. Welcome, Angela. So glad you've joined.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, well, we were just hearing from Audra about communicating with others in the supply chain. And, some companies are concerned about sharing private information. I know you can give us some insight into that.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's something that we definitely have concerns about. We are very aware of the nature of how the food industry works. And we want to make sure, like Bill said, that we are continuing to work with you all to put the correct information out there and make sure that you all know how to work together with each other. And, we just really encourage communication across the supply chain. This rule really depends on that. It's vital to have, supply chain partners coming together, trying to identify the best approaches so that we can all move forward together. Developing, some type of guide or implementation plan across industry that you all can agree upon about what supplier requirements might look like, I think is a really great starting place for industry to be in, sharing what those requirements are. Because, once you start putting these requirements on these distribution centers and various people down the supply chain about how you want your system to function, I think it's going to be really important that we all come together, all of industry comes together and try to have a good foundation so that everybody can build off of the same thing.
Yeah, I think that's key, and that the information being shared is not proprietary or confidential company information, right? That's like a key point to have to make here.
Absolutely. A lot of the elements that are required, the data elements that are required within the rule are things that people are already collecting, in their day-to-day business practices. A lot of the data elements that we're requiring are things like dates and addresses and names and quantities. So these are things that, you're already collecting for financial purposes to verify that you've sent product to someone and verifying that you've actually received that. So there are some requirements that, of course, are a little different, like the traceability lot code source. But again, we did try to come up with the traceability lot code source reference, which again will allow you to mask who the traceability lot code source is. So that way, again, you're protecting some of that confidentiality as well.
Can you explain that a little bit? So you have a traceability lot code reference, which enables you to mask. Just explain that for those that are on the call and make sure they understand.
Sure. So the traceability lot code source is the entity that applies the traceability lot code. Now, in some instances, obviously that could be your firm itself, or it could be a third party who's maybe co-manufacturing for you. And so, you may not want that information to be out there publicly because, again, you have to pass along the supply chain, the traceability lot code source, until there's a transformation that occurs, which then a new traceability lot code source would then be applied. So what we have done is created this concept of traceability lot code source reference, where firms can use various covered identifiers to mask that information. So for example, you could use your food facility registration number that you have registered for through FDA, and you can put that as your traceability lot code source reference. And then again, that'll pass along the supply chain. And then when it comes to FDA, when we gather that information, we'll be able to access it. You could use maybe a website where you have it so that, it's encrypted in such a way where you have to have maybe a .gov email address to access the information. So there's various ways that firms can choose to create these traceability lot code source references, and a lot of options. But again, the key to it is that whatever option you choose, it must be easy for FDA to access. So that way we can understand and know who the traceability lot code source is. Because again, if you do it in some complex way where we can't identify it, that'll be difficult for us to access that information across the supply chain, especially once we're going into retail.
Yeah, Angela, we have a question in the chat that applies directly to this. I'm going to go ahead and throw out to you about, are there more examples of using a traceability lot code source reference that you might be able to share with us?
So yeah, we know that there are certain standards and certain initiatives that have abilities to capture this kind of information, and you can use some of those identifiers that you might get using those initiatives or standards. And so again, in some situations, those would be acceptable because again, we just need to focus on the key being FDA has to be able to access that information. So regardless of how you choose to do it, we just need to have access to that information. So if it's going to be stored in some type of database, then again, FDA will have to have access to said database so we can then identify the specific company. But we do realize that over the years, you all have been working to create various standards and different data points that will capture some of that traceability lot code source information. And so again, the rule is completely flexible in how you choose to do that. And so it's just a matter of you telling us how you're doing that.
Thank you so much for clarifying that. Now, that, like you said, there are systems that exist today, and so we're looking to really improve on that by having, that communication piece kind of above the company information. How can we focus on improving on what exists today? What do companies need to do?
So really, again, it's a lot more communication, a lot more standardization. I think the issue that we run into a lot during the traceback investigations, during these outbreak responses, is that the data is so inconsistent. The availability of records is inconsistent. It varies from where you are in the supply chain. It varies from how large the company is to how small the company is. There are people that we encounter that don't know anything really about traceability. And then we know that there are some out there that have very sophisticated systems. And so I think the biggest key is really this piece of standardization. This rule is really important because we want to foster standardization so that way it takes some of that fear away, right? So when FDA comes to you and asks for these records, you know what we're asking for, you know what we're expecting to see, versus right now what we're seeing is, a lot of fear, a lot of people that are unsure of what our information requests consist of. And so by having these key pieces of data that we require based on the activity that you perform, you'll know what the expectation is. And then you can build on what you're collecting to make it more standardized. As you can imagine, collecting this information across multiple supply chains for multiple products and trying to analyze that data very quickly it's a lot of work. It takes a lot of work for us to become experts on a particular company's supply or a particular company's traceability process, and then trying to do that for the next company, and then doing that for the next company. And so we're doing this across the supply chain for however many people have been included in that, how many firms are included in that process. And so that's very time consuming. You know, you have a record and it just says date. Was that ship date? Is that a receive date? You have a quantity. How much is that? You know, so trying to put these standards together and make the records easier to understand will really help foster a more effective and efficient tracing process.
Yeah, thanks, Angela. It sounds like what exists today might be a little bit more general to the greater public, like specific for that company, they know what that is. But by standardizing and identifying how the particular date fields that are required so that you can label them properly, so that as you pass them along the supply chain or receive them from before the food item gets to you or the ingredient gets to you, it's all standard. Everybody's putting the right information into the right buckets, so that from a traceability standpoint, when you go, like you're on the response team, so you have lived this trying to figure out what they're talking about. Whereas if everybody is standard, like you said, the communication piece and standardizing it, then everybody's speaking the same language and putting the ship date in the ship date field and the pack date in the pack date field, whatever those dates are.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that will also help with the initial conversations as well, right? So coming in, we can have a more well-rounded, a more informed conversation versus spending time saying, okay, well, we got your records. What does this mean? And pointing to various data elements saying, okay, explain to us, what's this relationship? How does that work? How can we interpret that? Whereas with this rule, if we know that I'm a shipper, then when I send my electronic sortable spreadsheet that has all of my data elements on it, I can say, okay, for sure that this is the ship date. Okay, for sure, this is the date, this is the product description, and this is consistent across the board versus, okay, now maybe this is a delivery date, maybe this is a receiving date. We don't really know. And so it's really hard for us to make an analysis based on that kind of information. But like you said, once it's standardized and once we know exactly what it means, then that will really aid in the analysis and interpretation process.
Thank you. That information just helps to demystify what's happening here, I think, for all that are trying to figure that out. We do have a question in the chat. If you don't mind me just asking you these as we go, and we're talking how far back must the trace back go? So if we're in a 3PL and receive a said load on affected products, we must be able to trace back to the point of shipment/supplier or further.
So this rule is a little different than the one up, one back that people are used to. You are only required to, for FSMA 204D, you are only required to provide us with the KDEs or the key data elements for each critical tracking event or activity that you perform. So if as a 3PL, you're only shipping and receiving product, then the expectation is that when you submit your electronic sortable spreadsheet to us, that you will have receiving KDEs and you'll have the shipping KDEs. You won't need to necessarily have the full pedigree. I know that's a question that people have had a lot. Do I need to have the full pedigree of my supply chain or of my product? And the answer is no. You are only required to provide what you are doing at your firm. And then if you do have those other pieces of information and you want to put it together, then of course we'll accept that. But again, you're not required to do that. You're only required to supply us what information you have related to the activities that you are performing.
Great. Thank you, Angela. And here, time is of the essence here, correct?
Absolutely. 24 hours. And again, that again comes from our experience. We have put out information requests and it's taken weeks for us to get the data back. And for a variety of reasons, maybe somebody's on leave, maybe they can't contact the right person. Maybe there's some time zone issues of receiving the information, or there's some translations that need to happen. And so we wanted to have a baseline of 24 hours so that we could agree to get that information as quickly as possible. Now, we do have a little denotation in the rule that says, or an agreed upon time frame by FDA. So if there are instances, because again, this rule does cover foreign and domestic, we want to make sure that we are accounting for some of that. So it is a discussion. We are going to require you to give us it within 24 hours, and we can enforce against it after 24 hours. However, we are going to be willing to come up with a compromise if necessary to make sure that we're receiving the records as quickly as possible, but also accommodating the needs of those that are providing it.
Right. So communicating with the FDA is important too. If you have questions, if you have special situations, I know that you have a lot of resources available as well.
Absolutely. We actually just posted some updates today, earlier this morning. So we did finally post our electronic sortable spreadsheet template that is live online for you all to view. And again, this is just an example. There is no requirement for you to use the template that we are providing. We just wanted to provide a visualization so people had more perspective about what it could look like. But yes, we have a ton of resources on our website, and I highly suggest that you visit and look at them. We talk a little bit about the traceability lot code. We get into FAQs, and a lot of those FAQs are a compilation of questions that we've received either through speaking events and meetings, but also some of the questions that have been sent directly to us that needed a little bit more explanation and further interpretation. So those FAQs, we're always updating them. And we also even have a date on the side of each FAQ, so you'll know which ones are the most recent. So you can sort for the newest ones that have been posted. But again, there's a plethora of resources available for you all.
Great. And we are going to be providing all of you with those resources in the follow-up email after this event. So you will get links to all that we've talked about here and maybe some more in addition to that. Angela, is there anything else you want to say before we move on to our next conversation?
I just want to really encourage you all and really drill home this concept of we really do want to educate before and while we regulate. This rule really depends on communication across the supply chain, but we also understand that there is an element of communication that needs to happen between the agency and industry as well. And so we truly do mean that we want to work with you all. We want to understand your struggles and your pain points and your challenges so that we can have more perspective about what needs to happen, what communication materials we need to create, what things we might need to discuss, if there's any changes that are needed, or different things that can happen as a result of these conversations. And so I know that folks kind of get a little nervous when it comes to thinking about enforcement and compliance, but I want to really encourage you all to know that we truly do mean that we want to educate before and while we regulate, because we understand that this is a complex rule. And so we want to work with you all the best that we can.
Great. Thank you, Angela. And we will see you back for the Q&A section after this next conversation. If we could have Bill and Audra back up with me for our final conversation, you are probably asking yourself, okay, what do we do now? And what should we do next? And I know Bill and Audra have some good next steps for that.
Yeah, I'd like to make a comment quick. While this is a little complex, while it's requiring us to do some things that we haven't done before, I think we have to understand we're talking about the health of people here, and the health of our families, the health of children. And this is an important legislation that goes directly to affecting that. And I hope that everyone got from Angela's conversation the spirit of cooperation that the FDA is bringing towards us. They have been so responsive and so cooperative in discussions that we've had with them. But getting started in moving towards compliance is one of the hardest things for people, because they don't want to make a mistake, and they want to make sure that what they're doing is going to work with their suppliers and their customers. But the first thing that we'd recommend is start an internal team. Create an internal team that is made up of what I would call an internal champion, someone in the high level of the organization that can bring in the necessary resources to move towards FDA compliance. So you'd have an internal champion, then a team champion that would run the team itself. And that team would be made up of representatives of various functional groups like purchasing, receiving, warehousing. If you're a manufacturer, someone from the production group, transportation, sales, because this affects customers as well as suppliers, finance, and very important, the IT group. But getting these all together is what Farm to Plate helps organizations with. We can work with companies to create these teams and set them up to do their internal analysis of where they're at.
Great. Thank you, Bill. I think one of the main things, that internal team is a great next step. If people on the call haven't done that yet, that's the first place to go, is to get that communication internally going. But also, how do we start the communication up and down the supply chain? That's another question.
I can take that on because I speak with clients every day. One of the recommendations we have is to just really simply send a letter of communication saying, we'd like to know what your additional traceability plan is. Where do you stand? So that gives them idea, like, or it gives you an idea if it's on their radar, how far along are they? And, I'm going to try to address, like, I think somewhat the elephant in the room. What if they say, we're moving forward with X data company, but, we want to see what we can do. Well, we can work with other data companies. We can help you share that data across platforms. So keep that in mind. But sending a letter, getting a feel for where they're at, and beginning that communication is so important. And we've developed a couple format letters that we'll be happy to share post webinar, and you can start that. Just, we're trying to take the workload off of you because we know you have so many other things that you're managing, and this should be something that you have experts to help you with.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Audra, because I think that's one of the main things is, this is outside of maybe the expertise that people have in the food industry, particularly. So I know you and Bill from Farm to Plate are looking to kind of be a strategic partner and also have an open hand with other companies that are in the supply chain. So everybody doesn't have to be with one company. The companies need to communicate seamlessly as well, the supply chain providers. So that is one of the differentiators, I think, for Farm to Plate, is they are very open to communicating across the supply chain, all pieces of that. Well, how do you figure out, what you need to be compliant, like where a company might be now, and then what the delta is between where they need to be and how to analyze that?
Yes, you may have heard the term gap analysis. That's something that we can help you with. It's a deep dive. It's free. We can help you, like, really dig into, okay, here's your status quo and here's where you need to be. And again, it focuses on these acronyms, the KDEs and the CTEs. And because we're built on a blockchain backbone, you have the chance now with technology, the way it's developed, you don't have to share your secret sauce, because that's always been a worry. And we hear this at trade shows all the time, don't we, Bill? Where they're like, oh gosh, we don't want private label brands, especially. We want to enable what you envision with only getting them the 24-hour lead time that they're going to need for only the required data that they're going to need. So we can help with that.
So important, because a lot of, there's some organizations have dozens or hundreds of suppliers or customers, and that gap analysis alone can be overwhelming, right? So thanks for offering a free hand there to be strategic. Well, how do we get started with, sharing pieces of resources? Like, do we have some how to get started resources?
We do, and it's not just resources available from Farm to Plate, although we certainly have those. You heard Angela talk about the variety of resources that FDA has, and they certainly should be one of the first people that first organizations that you go to learn more about FSMA 204. But there's also an organization called GS1. And GS1 sets the standards in terms of data requirements for the industry. And that is something that a lot of companies in the industry are working towards. But they're a tremendous resource on data about FSMA Rule 204 in every level of the supply chain. They've worked with manufacturers, harvesters, right down through to consumers. Excuse me. Most product categories have associations that are well aware of FSMA 204. People like the National Fisheries Institute, the International Fresh Produce Association, organizations such as that, International Dairy Deli Bake Association. They have resources. So if your product falls into a category that has an association, ask them. And I'm sure that they'd be able to provide resources as well. And then there are business associations like the International Food Manufacturers Association, IFMA, International Food Distributors Association, or IFDA, and the National Restaurant Association. They also have resources available. So there is a lot of information out there. It can be easy to get overwhelmed by all of it, but that's something that Farm to Plate can help you with, is to sort through and determine what affects your company, what's relevant to your company, and taking that initial step and initial steps that Audra and I talked about earlier to get started towards compliance. The worst thing that can happen right now is no action, because time is ticking, and this is something that we all have to work towards together, everybody in the food supply chain.
Yeah, thank you, Bill. And thank you for those references. And when you talked about GS1, those on the call may not know that Farm to Plate sponsors a podcast video cast show called Future Food Cast. And just this week, yesterday, as a matter of fact, we have a whole episode with a representative from the GS1 US supply chain, and we talk a lot about Rule 204. So if you want some additional information about the standardization that GS1 is providing for companies in the supply chain, because they work outside of the food industry. They've done this with other industries before. They have a wealth of experience. Please reference that episode. Well, at this point, I'd love to invite Angela to come back up with us. Thank you, Bill and Audra. And we'd like to have an open Q&A section. We do have a couple questions in the chat that we need to handle first off. Angela, you covered for Keith about how far back the tracing needed to go. And he had a follow-up question saying, so basically an inventory of said product, correct? When he talked about how far back they had to track the product. I don't know if
So
you
it's a
recall.
little more than an inventory. I mean, I guess it's the most simplistic form. It's kind of a representation of the inventory, but it's really focused on the activity that you perform. So if you are, say, a food manufacturer that is transforming a food product to creating food on the list, or just transforming FTL ingredients already, you're going to need to track that process. So we're going to want to know the input information. So what traceability lot codes of the food on the traceability list that you used, and quantities and some other requirements, what information went into making the product that you did. And then on the back end, the output, we will want to know what's the new traceability lot code that you're assigning, what's the product description, what's some of the completion dates, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a little bit more than an inventory. We are still tracking the movement of it's basically tracking the movement of a lot code within your facility. So that's kind of the most simplistic version of what this could look like. And again, we're focusing on the activities that you perform.
Okay. And from Tiffany, we are going to be sharing, you can contact the Farm to Plate people for sample letters after the webinar, engage with them, and they can help you with that. Keith has another question. What are the highest risk level products affected initially? Again, please.
So I provided a link in the
Angela
chat
did.
links
see
to
that.
the risk ranking model results. So you can see the breakdown of all the food commodities that were considered and then how they rank against each other. And so basically what we've done is we've taken a lot of different sources of data. So we've had data from our outbreak investigations. We've had data from industry that's been provided. We've had data from the NORS website. So we've taken that into account against the criteria that Congress mandated for us to rank them against. And then that's how the list was developed.
Okay, great. And thank you to everyone who put, I know Angela, but other attendees that put links in the chat that are helpful to everyone. Thank you so much. We appreciate that. Allison has a question. Other than sending the ASN with the KDE and or PLN, what other requirements fall into FSMA? PTI requirement or other? And maybe you can unpack some of these letter acronyms for us as well.
Yeah, so for the ASN, which is a notice, advanced ship notice that is sent in advance of the shipment, they can contain some of the KDEs, some of the key data elements that are required under the rulemaking. And so, yes, you can send with an ASN if you have you can use that as a record that will document the data elements that you're required to have. There is, again, the rule creates a lot of flexibility. So we don't have one specific way that you have to do any given thing. You can do a combination of things. You can say that my ASN contains some of my key data elements. You can say I have a bill of lading that contains some of the key data elements, or you can have, a database that has all the information in it that you want to provide. Either way, you do have to send all of the compiled data elements in your electronic sortable spreadsheet. So that will at least allow us to see it in one large view. But for the produce traceability initiative requirements and any other initiative, standard, or association organization that's out there that has requirements or suggestions of how to comply with the rule, as long it is the firm that is covered by the rule, it is their responsibility to ensure that whatever initiative or standards that you're using, that it contains the data elements that you're required to have for the activity that you perform or for the critical tracking event. So we don't endorse any one particular standard or initiative, but we do know that there are some out there that will be capturing information that will allow you to comply with the rule. So again, as the covered entity, it is your responsibility to be knowledgeable enough with the rule to know that whatever initiative you're using or standard that you're applying, that you are gathering the right pieces of information and providing that to FDA upon request, or maintaining that for the 2 years as required by the rule.
Great. Thank you, Angela. We are so glad you're here providing all this great information. We have another question. How is the more than, quote, one up, one back, end quote, besides the introduction of the TLC and the TLC source?
So it, again, provides standardization within one up, one back. There are a lot of elements within it that are if applicable or if available. In the food traceability rule, these are all requirements. So if the situation applies to you, if you perform a certain critical tracking event and there's not an exemption that applies or some type of modified requirement that would apply, so like a partial exemption, then you are required to provide all of the information that's listed within that critical tracking event. And then in addition to that, it builds on one up, one back because it really creates this line of connectivity. So that's where the traceability lock code source and the traceability lock code come in, because with one up, one back, we have to go to each firm that's identified and collect those records to know the next firm that's going to be identified that we have to collect additional information from. On the contrary, with the food traceability rule, our hope is that when implemented correctly, we will be able to skip steps. So for example, we could go into a retailer and have information about the processor. And so while we're putting out our information request, we could simultaneously be asking for data from the distribution center and the food and the processor at the same time, versus having to go step by step by step. So there creates this line of connectivity that allows for some efficiencies to be built in as a result of the rule.
Yeah, great. And I think it's that line of connectivity that we've kind of had as a theme throughout the event today, that we're trying to establish that seamless communication. Any comments from Bill or Audra? I have another question I was going to
Let's
ask.
keep going with questions.
Okay.
This is great.
Great. Well, Jeremy has a question, and I put in the chat, if you'd like to come on camera and ask your question, please do. Just raise your hand and we'll spotlight you. Audra answered this a little bit, but
I did.
for everyone, what does this look like from a cold chain standpoint, meaning just storing / shipping product for different distributors? Audra, you want to answer that?
Yeah, it's fairly unique position. Lucky Jeremy. So, it's a special, but we do have that pinned down. So I can send a spreadsheet showing exactly what that needs to look like for your position in the supply chain. And just to mention too, it is going to be different for what your function is. So what they're asking you to capture will be, unique to your position in the supply chain. So we'll be sharing that.
Great. So the key is to check what, Bill, I didn't mean to talk over you, but check the requirements for your particular situation, right? I think Bill is probably going to say that.
Absolutely. The CTEs, when you take a look at the tracking events that the FDA is focusing on, the distributor performs a receiving and a sending. Each one of those CTEs have the KDEs under them, or the key data elements that need to be captured. And that's what Audra's referring to, is that we can help with the identification of the KDEs and how to capture that data internally with the company.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thank you. Well, I have a couple of questions outside of the chat that I'd like to ask. When will the food traceability list be updated? That's probably
that's a great question. So we plan to evaluate the food traceability list about every 5 years. And so there'll be a process where we will evaluate the list, we'll take in the data, we'll reanalyze it against the model, see if there are any changes to the food traceability list. If there are changes to the food traceability list, then we will put in the Federal Register notice the proposed traceability list, allow time for comments, and then we'll finalize that list. Once that the new food traceability list is updated, you will have 2 years if you're rolling onto the list, meaning if a new food is added to the list, you will have 2 years to come into compliance from the point that that new version of the FTL has been finalized. If there is a food that comes off of the list or will be deleted from the list, then that will happen effective immediately. So from the point that that food item or the food traceability list is finalized, then that food will come off and you will no longer be required to maintain the 204 records.
Okay, thanks for that, Angela. I think that's moving forward. That's important information to have. Of concern to everyone on here, what is the compliance and enforcement strategy?
Yeah, that's like the #1 question that we get. So we're still in the process of developing our implementation enforcement strategy, but it just goes back to what I was saying earlier about we really plan to educate before and while we regulate. So we want to demystify it a bit. And, yes, the compliance date is January 20, 2026. On that day, you will be required to have these records. Now, does that mean that we're going to show up on the 21st and start issuing warning letters? Probably not. We can, but we probably won't do that. We wanted to create space to make sure that we are allowing industry to ask us questions and comply with the rule. So in the event of a public health emergency, then yes, we are going to expect that after January 20th, 2026, you do have the accurate information in the event of a public health emergency. Now, outside of that, we are providing another year before we start doing routine inspections. So meaning that we're coming to firms to actually check that they're maintaining the appropriate pieces of information as they should be. So we're giving another year to do that. So again, if there's a public health emergency, you will be held accountable after January 20, 2026, but we will not be coming and checking on a routine basis until 2027.
Okay. Good to know. And thank you, Audra, for after the webinar providing some resources to, it seems like, a number of distributors that we have on the call with us today. One other question here, is industry required to capture key data elements on labels?
So there is not a labeling requirement. We realize that labeling will assist in communication of some of these data elements. So of course, if your firm decides that that's how you want to communicate the information, then that's absolutely acceptable. However, there are no specifications for labeling within the rule itself. So you can send your records via email, you can send it snail mail, you can send it through, some type of technological database if that's how you choose to do it. Again, there's no technology requirements for the rule making, so you do not have to have technology to comply with the rule. You can still have paper records to comply with the rule if you choose to do so. But you can send that information in whatever form or format you choose to do. And obviously, again, that goes back to the communication where you need to be communicating with your suppliers and your customers about how you plan to send that information so that everyone can be prepared to not only send it, but also receive it.
Thank you, Angela. Ed has a question. Can you provide a range of lot numbers that could have been shipped?
So the rule says that for each traceability lot that is shipped, you must provide us the location where each lot code was sent, 1-to-1. So we want to know that if you sent traceability lot code A to location X, that traceability lot code A went to location X. If you send traceability lot code A to locations X, Y, and Z, then we want to know that traceability lot code A went to those 3 locations. And again, it's important for us to be able to track these traceability lot codes to understand how the product is moving. Now, there are some conversations about what can be done about the difficulties that industry is facing with traceability lot codes. And so there are things that we're considering in trying to understand better from industry so that we can determine if there need to be any changes. But right now, we very much feel that it's important for us to track lot codes to every location that they went. Because again, that is a large point of where we lose a lot of the traceability when we don't have that connectivity. We see that from distribution into retail, oftentimes the traceability lot codes are lost, or lot codes in general are lost. And so that really hinders our investigation because now we have to look at a larger range of products that may not have even been impacted by the contamination event. And so now we're doing product actions for a larger scope. So it could be, a larger range of items, a whole region of product. And that's not really the impact that we want to have because again, we are still trying to protect industry in addition to protecting public health. And so by having that specificity and being able to track those lot codes as specifically as possible will really help us narrow the scope of what our product actions could be and narrow the scope of our investigation in some instances, because again, we'll have that specificity that we're looking for.
Thank you. A couple more questions we can cover in the last few minutes. Is there an exemption for commingled products on the FTL? How would a processor assign a TLC for a commingled lot?
So there are some exemptions for commingled product. Commingling must happen after harvesting, but before processing, and it really only applies to shell eggs and seafood. So if you do commingle products, then there are some exemptions within the rule where you'll have in some cases, have a modified set of requirements or have no requirements. And so if the processor then does something to the product that then puts it back on the FTL, or they are covered by the rule, then they will just assign the TLC how they choose to do so. So again, there's no requirements of how a firm assigns a traceability lot code. They can choose to do it by, a random alphanumeric that they chose, or they can use some type of standard that they want to use to assign their lot codes. I know that some of the initiatives out there do have some specifications of how they like to see lot codes coded. And so again, however the processor that's covered by the rule chooses to do so, the rule provides flexibility for that. We just require that in your traceability plan, you explain to us how you coded your traceability lot code, so that way we can understand if there are important pieces of information that we want to pull out of the lot code, we know how that translates.
Great. One last question here from Allison about the label requirement. Just clarifying, there's no label requirement because some customers are asking for an LPN labels. Is this just their request and not FDA request? Not an FDA request.
The food traceability rule has no labeling requirements. There's no technology requirement and there's no labeling requirement. Again, as I mentioned earlier, we understand that putting some of the information on the label will likely be helpful. But again, the rule itself does not have any labeling or formatting requirements. Again, we're just asking for information about how you're choosing to do some of these processes, like assigning a traceability lot code or identifying the foods in your firm that are on the food traceability list.
Thank you, Angela. Do we have any other comments from Bill, Audra, anyone else on the call before we close?
I think this has been fantastic, and especially for distributors who are in a position where they carry multiple product categories. Many manufacturers just focus on one category, but the distributors have a variety. So taking a look at implementing a system like this can be daunting for them. But I think that a lot of the questions were clarified today, and I really appreciate Angela and her comments.
Yeah. Great. And Jennifer, thank you for your great comments in the chat. I want to thank you, Angela, again, as Bill did, for taking your time and representing such great information from the FDA perspective and helping our attendees just unpack some of the requirements here and maybe feel a little bit more comfortable and confident moving forward. And thank you, Bill and Audra, for coming on from a supplier in the food supply chain from a software company to give your perspective. And after the call, I know you'll be sharing your resources, and our attendees appreciate that. I welcome them to engage with you, and thank you to Farm to Plate, who brought this event to you. Have a great day.